There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the big ones. Not the day I signed the first contract. Not the morning I handed Derek the keys to the office. Not even the afternoon we buried my wife under the oak tree at Hillside Cemetery while the whole town showed up in their Sunday clothes. Those moments I've made my peace with. Most of them, anyway. The moment I keep coming back to is smaller than all of that. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, maybe less. It was a Saturday in October. My granddaughter Lily was getting married in the white church on Callaway Road. The same church where her grandmother and I stood 41 years ago and made promises we both kept, until death made it impossible to keep them any longer. The pews smelled like old wood and candle wax. The morning light came through the stained glass and put colors on everything. Blue on the floor, gold on the faces of people I'd known my whole life. Lily had saved me a seat in the front row. She'd told me herself. 2 weeks before the wedding, standing in my kitchen with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She said, "Grandpa, I want you where I can see you. Front row. Promise me." And I promised her. I sat in that chair, I felt the cushion under me, and I looked at the tinted card she'd had someone make with my name on it in careful handwriting. Raymond Callaway. Right there. Front row. And then Derek came in. He came in with a group of men I recognized, businessmen, developers, the kind of people who wear suits that cost more than my first truck. He looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you need to move, to make room for something more important. Not with cruelty, not even with awareness, really. Just with the calm assumption that the chair I was sitting in was available. He leaned down and spoke quietly. He said there'd been a change in the seating. He said he hoped I understood. I understood. I stood up. I took the card with my name on it and I put it in my jacket pocket. I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Not there, not then. Not with Lily about to walk down that aisle in her mother's veil. So I found myself a seat 3 rows back, on the aisle, next to a woman I didn't know. And I sat down and I folded my hands in my lap and I watched my granddaughter get married. I didn't cry. I never cry at weddings, but I want to tell you something. Sitting there in that 3rd row, in my best suit, with my name in my pocket, I thought about a question I hadn't asked myself in a long time. I thought about where it had all gone wrong. Not the company, not the money. The thing that matters more than either of those, the family I'd spent my whole life trying to build. To understand that Saturday in October, you need to go back further. You need to go back to the beginning. And the beginning, for me, starts with a piece of land, a borrowed truck, and a man who had nothing but time and the willingness to work until his hands bled. That man was me. My name is Raymond Callaway. I'm 66 years old. I grew up in Harlan County. Not the famous part, not the part people write songs about. Just a patch of eastern Kentucky where the hills fold in on themselves and the winters come early and stay late. My father worked in the mines until the mines decided they were done with him, and after that, he worked at whatever would have him. He was not a complicated man. He believed in showing up, in keeping your word, and in never asking for anything you hadn't earned. He passed those 3 things on to me like they were the only inheritance he had. Maybe they were. I left Harlan when I was 19 with $200, a duffel bag, and the address of a cousin in Indiana who said there was construction work if I wanted it. I wanted it. I loaded gravel. I poured concrete. I framed houses in summer heat that made the air shimmer over the asphalt. I learned everything I could from every man who would teach me. Some of them were generous. Some of them weren't. I learned from both kinds. By the time I was 30, I had enough saved to start something of my own. I borrowed a truck from my father-in-law, Margaret's father, A quiet man named George who said yes before I finished asking, and I drove to Millhaven, Indiana, which is the town where I've lived ever since. Millhaven is the kind of place that doesn't make the news. Population just under 12,000. One main street, 2 diners, a hardware store that's been in the same family since 1953. People know your name here. They know your father's name. They remember what you did and what you didn't do. That matters more than people think. I registered Callaway Construction in the spring of 1984. The first job was a garage addition for a man named Phil Hester, who lived out on Route 9. Phil paid me in cash and referred me to his brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law referred me to someone else. And that's how it goes when you're starting out. One handshake at a time, one job at a time, one reputation built, one day at a time. Margaret was with me through all of it. Margaret Callaway was the kind of woman who made every room feel more organized just by walking into it. Not because she was controlling, she wasn't. She just had a clarity about her that settled everything around her. She kept the books for the company in those early years, working at the kitchen table after Derek went to bed. Her reading glasses sliding down her nose, a cup of decaf going cold beside her. She never complained about the hours. She never told me the numbers looked bad, even when they did. She'd just say, "We're going to need a good month, Ray." And I'd nod, and we'd figure out how to have a good month. Derek was born in 1983, a year before the company started. He grew up inside Callaway Construction, the way some kids grow up inside a church. It was just the atmosphere of our house, the thing that shaped everything. He came to job sites with me on Saturdays when he was small. He learned to read a blueprint before he learned to drive. I thought that was a gift I was giving him, a foundation, something solid to stand on. And for a long time, it seemed like it was. Derek was smart in school and smarter in business. He had a confidence I recognized because I'd worked my whole life to develop it, except that in him it came naturally, without the scars. That should have pleased me more than it worried me, and mostly it did. I told myself I'd built something worth handing down. I told myself that was the whole point. By the time Derek was 35, he was running more of the day-to-day operations than I was. He had ideas I didn't always agree with. Faster timelines, bigger bids, newer equipment. I wasn't sure we needed, but some of his ideas were good, better than good. He landed us a contract with a regional developer out of Indianapolis that tripled our revenue in 2 years. I remember sitting across from him at dinner the night he told me, watching him talk with his hands, the way he always did when he was excited, and thinking, this is it. This is what you build for. Margaret passed away in the spring of 2019, pancreatic cancer. She was diagnosed in February and gone by April. 2 months. There wasn't time to prepare, not that you can ever truly prepare. And the house went quiet, in a way that has never entirely stopped being surprising to me. Even now, 4 years later, I'll come downstairs in the morning, and for one half-awake second, I'll think I hear her in the kitchen. I think grief does that to you. Keeps one foot in the past no matter how far you walk forward. After Margaret died, I made the decision to step back from the company. It wasn't grief alone, though grief was part of it. It was also the honest recognition that I was 63 years old, that the industry had changed in ways that required energy I no longer had in the same quantities, and that Derek was ready, or at least I believed he was ready. I sat him down in the office, my office, the one with the old leather chair I'd had since the 90s, and I told him I was stepping down as chairman and that I was recommending to the board that he take the position. He shook my hand across the desk. He looked me in the eye and he said, "I won't let you down, Dad." I believed him. I still believe he meant it when he said it. What I didn't fully account for was what success does to a person when they receive it before they've had to fight for it the way their father fought. I'm not saying Derek didn't work hard. He did. But there's a difference between working hard inside a structure that someone else built and building the structure yourself from nothing. The difference is invisible when things are going well. It only shows up when things go wrong. For a while after I stepped down, I kept my distance the way you're supposed to. Let the man do his job. Don't hover. I stayed home. I took walks. I learned to cook things beyond eggs and sandwiches. I called old friends I'd been too busy to call for years. I was doing what retired men are supposed to do, but I was also watching. And what I saw, after about 6 months, was that some of the relationships I'd built over 30 years were starting to fray at the edges. Not dramatically, just cooling. Arthur Pennington, who'd been our biggest private partner for nearly 15 years, mentioned to me at the hardware store one morning that he hadn't heard from Derek in a while. The Kowalski brothers, who handled most of our subcontracting in the northern counties, seemed uncertain about a contract renewal. Small things. The kind of things that only look like warning signs if you've been in the business long enough to know what to watch for. So I made some calls. I had some lunches. I smoothed some things over without advertising that I was doing it. Arthur and I had dinner, and I listened to his concerns. And by the end of the evening, he'd agreed to extend his partnership for another 3 years. The Kowalski brothers came around after I drove out to their yard and shook their hands in person. I did what I'd always done. I used the relationships I'd spent a lifetime building, and I kept the ship from taking on water. I never told Derek. I told myself I didn't tell him because I didn't want to undermine his confidence. Maybe that was true. But looking back now, I think there was something else in it too. Something I'm not entirely proud of. I think part of me wasn't ready to let go completely. Part of me needed to still be needed, even if no one knew about it. That's the thing about stepping aside. It's harder than it looks from the outside. The call from Lily came on a Tuesday morning in late August. I was in the backyard pulling weeds from the garden. Margaret's garden, technically, though I'd kept it going as best I could because letting it die felt like letting something else die along with it. My phone was on the porch railing, and I almost didn't hear it over the sound of the sprinkler. I pulled off my gloves and answered with dirt still on my fingers. "Grandpa?" Her voice had that brightness in it that I'd known since she was 4 years old and used to run to the door when I came over for Sunday dinners. "I have news." The news was that she and a young man named Thomas Hargrove, who I'd met twice and liked both times, a quiet, solid fellow who worked in civil engineering and seemed to understand that Lily was the most important thing in any room she walked into, had gotten engaged the night before. She'd said yes over dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of in Indianapolis, and now she was calling everyone who mattered. I was on the list of everyone who mattered. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. She told me about the ring her grandmother's stone, reset in a new setting that Thomas had chosen himself after asking me, which I hadn't known until that moment, and which moved me more than I let on. She told me they wanted a small wedding, maybe 100 people, at the White Church on Callaway Road. She told me she wanted it in October because October in Millhaven is the most beautiful month of the year, and she wanted the photographs to have the color of the leaves in them. She was right about October. She's always been right about the things that matter. Before she hung up, she said something that I've thought about many times since. She said, "Grandpa, I want you front and center at this wedding. I mean it. You're the most important person in my life who's still here." She didn't say it unkindly. She wasn't trying to point to the absence of her grandmother. She was just telling me the truth, in the way Lily always tells the truth, directly and without apology. I told her I'd be there. I told her front and center was fine with me. I hung up and stood there in the yard for a little while, with my phone in my hand. The sprinkler was still going. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the far end of the garden. A red male, The kind Margaret always said was good luck, though I never knew if she actually believed that or just liked the idea of it. I thought about what Lily had said, front and center. The most important person in my life who's still here. I thought about Derek, who I hadn't spoken to in 11 days. Not because of any fight, just because the calls had gotten shorter over the years, and then less frequent. And neither of us had done anything specific to stop it. That's how distance grows between people who love each other. Not with arguments, with silence, with busyness, with the slow accumulation of days where you mean to call and then don't. I went back to the weeds, but I was smiling. Whatever else was going on, whatever small accumulating aches came with being 66 and alone, and further from the center of things than I used to be. Lily was getting married in October, in the white church on Callaway Road, and she wanted me in the front row. For the next 2 months, that was enough. The 2 months between Lily's phone call and the wedding were quieter than I expected. Not in a bad way, just quiet. The way October itself is quiet in Millhaven. The kind of stillness that settles over a place when the summer noise is gone and the winter hasn't arrived yet to replace it with its own kind of hardness. The trees along Birchwood Avenue turned gold and then rust, and then a deep burgundy that always made me think of old leather. The mornings got cold enough that I started taking my coffee inside instead of on the porch. The garden was done for the year, put to bed the way Margaret always put it to bed, mulched, trimmed back, ready to wait. I had time to think. Maybe too much time. I thought about Derek more than I wanted to admit. We'd had 2 phone calls in those 2 months, both of them brief, both of them surface level in the way conversations get when 2 people have let too much time pass and neither one knows how to close the distance without acknowledging that the distance exists. He told me the company was doing well. I told him that was good to hear. He mentioned a new contract in the works, something with a commercial developer in Fort Wayne. I said it sounded promising. We talked about the weather, the way men do when they've run out of easier things to say. I didn't ask him about the seating arrangements for the wedding. That wasn't my place. Lily had called me twice more, once to tell me about the flowers she'd chosen, white dahlias and something with a name I couldn't pronounce, and once just to talk, which was always the real reason she called. She had her grandmother's habit of calling people, not because she needed anything specific, but because she believed staying in touch was its own purpose, its own gift. I loved that about her. I tried to tell her so, without making it sound like I was comparing her to someone she never had enough time with. On one of those calls she mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd arranged the seating herself. That she hadn't let her father's assistant handle it the way Derek had apparently suggested. She said she wanted to know exactly where everyone was sitting. She said some things were too important to delegate. I understood what she was telling me without her having to say it directly. She was telling me she'd taken care of it. She was telling me not to worry. I didn't worry, or I tried not to. There were moments, though, quiet moments in the evening, when I'd sit in the armchair by the window, the one Margaret had reupholstered in green fabric in 2015, because she said the old color had gotten tired, and I'd find myself thinking about the shape of things, about how a family can look whole from the outside and have gaps running through it that nobody talks about how I'd spent 30 years building a company, and somewhere in the middle of all that building, I'd let something else go unattended. Not deliberately, just the way you let a back room go unattended when the front of the house is always full of people who need something. I was the kind of father who showed up. I want to be clear about that. I was at Derek's games, his graduations, the hospital the night Lily was born. I was there for all of it. But showing up and being present aren't always the same thing. And I've come to understand that in the years since Margaret died. She was the one who made presence feel like presence. She was the one who asked the right questions, who sat with people long enough to hear the answer, who remembered what mattered to each person and brought it up again the next time she saw them. I provided, I protected, I built things. But Margaret made the house feel like a home. And when she left, I think Derek and I both lost the person who had always been translating between us. We'd never learned to translate for ourselves. The Friday before the wedding, I drove out to the church to drop off a card and a small gift for Lily, a pearl bracelet that had belonged to Margaret, one that Margaret herself had set aside years ago in a blue velvet box with a note inside that said simply, "For Lily, when the time comes." I'd been keeping that box in my desk drawer for 4 years, waiting for the right moment. This was the right moment. The church was busy with preparations. Florists were working in the nave, arranging things on the ends of the pews. A young woman with a clipboard was measuring distances between chairs in the reception area adjoining the garden. The pastor, a man named Gerald Hooper who'd baptized Lily 26 years ago, saw me come in and crossed the room to shake my hand. We stood there for a few minutes talking about the wedding, about the town, about people we both knew and hadn't seen in a while. Gerald was a good man. He had the quality I've always respected most in people, which is that he listened when you talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. He said, "Raymond, whatever happens this weekend, just remember you built something that brought all these people to this place. That's not nothing. That's everything." I didn't know exactly what he meant. Not yet. I thanked him and drove home in the early dark, the headlights sweeping across the familiar curves of Callaway Road, the trees bare enough now that I could see the fields behind them going on and on into the distance. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The suit was hanging on the back of the bedroom door, pressed and ready. The shoes were polished and waiting by the closet. And somewhere in the church behind me, in the front row, there was a chair with my name on it. I went inside and made dinner and went to bed early, the way you do the night before something important. The house was quiet. The October wind moved in the trees outside the window, and I lay there in the dark thinking that tomorrow I would see my granddaughter marry a good man, and I would sit in the front row where she put me, and for one day at least everything would feel the way it was supposed to feel. I was 66 years old. I had buried my wife. I had handed over everything I built. I had learned to be alone in a house full of memories. I figured I had earned one good day. I didn't know yet how much the morning would cost me. The morning of the wedding came in cold and clear. I was up before 6, the way I always am. My body decided years ago that sleeping past dawn was a luxury it wasn't interested in anymore, and I've made my peace with that. I put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, watching the light come up over the back fence. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue you only get in October, thin and clean, the kind of sky that makes everything underneath it look more defined than usual. The oak tree at the back of the yard had dropped most of its leaves overnight. They lay in a loose circle around the base of the trunk, like something arranged there on purpose. I thought about Margaret, not in a sad way. Or not only in a sad way, more in the way you think about someone who would have loved a morning like this. She always said October light was the most honest light of the year. I never asked her exactly what she meant by that. I wish now that I had. There are a lot of things I wish I'd asked her while I still could. That's the cruelest part of losing someone, not the absence itself, but the slow discovery of all the questions you forgot to ask while they were still there to answer them. I poured my coffee and sat at the kitchen table without turning on the television or the radio. I didn't need the noise. I had enough going on inside my own head to keep me company. I thought about Lily walking down the aisle. I thought about Thomas waiting for her at the altar, the way a young man stands in that moment, trying to look calm and not quite managing it. I thought about the white dahlias she'd chosen for her bouquet, and whether the cold snap overnight might have done anything to affect them. I was not thinking about Derek. I was trying very hard not to think about Derek. At 7:30, I went upstairs and dressed. The suit was dark charcoal gray. I'd bought it for Margaret's funeral and worn it only twice since. Both times for occasions that asked a man to look his best while feeling something less than that. I'd considered buying something new for the wedding. In the end, I decided this suit was the right choice. It fit well. It held its shape. And there was something right about wearing the same suit I'd worn to say goodbye to Margaret, to the occasion of watching her granddaughter begin her life with the man she loved. A thread of continuity, a quiet honoring of the woman who had made all of this possible in ways no one fully accounted for anymore. I knotted my tie in the bathroom mirror. A burgundy silk tie that Derek had given me for Christmas 5 or 6 years ago, back when gift-giving between us still felt natural and unscripted. I polished my shoes one more time, even though they didn't need it. Then I went downstairs, rinsed my coffee cup, put on my overcoat, and picked up the envelope on the counter. A card for Lily and Thomas, with something inside it that I won't tell you the amount of, because that's between me and them. I locked the front door and walked to my car in the cold morning air. The drive to the church took 11 minutes. I know because I've driven that road so many times over so many years that I've stopped noticing the distance and started noticing only the time. 11 minutes down Callaway Road, past the open fields, past the old Hester property where I'd built my very first garage addition 40 years ago. Past the water tower with the town's name painted on it in letters that had faded from blue to a kind of tired gray. I always slow down when I pass that water tower. I don't know exactly why. It's just a habit that settled into me somewhere along the way certain habits do quietly, without announcement, until one day you realize you've been doing it for years. The church parking lot was already half full when I arrived, which surprised me, given that the ceremony wasn't until 10. But that's the way it is in a place like Millhaven. People come early to weddings, not just for the good seats, though that's part of it, but because a wedding in a small town is a community occasion. And people who understand community know that showing up early is itself a form of respect. I parked near the back of the lot. I've never liked taking the close spots. Always felt they should go to people who needed them more than I did. I walked across the gravel toward the church entrance in the cold, still air. The morning smelled like fallen leaves and wood smoke from somewhere I couldn't locate. The white steeple rose up against that pale October sky, and I stood for a moment just looking at it. The way you look at something you've known your whole life and still find beautiful, without being able to explain exactly why. Gerald Hooper was at the door greeting people as they arrived. He shook my hand and held it a moment longer than a regular handshake. He looked at me with an expression I'd seen on him before, the expression of a man who knows more than he's saying and has made a deliberate choice about that. I didn't ask him about it. There would be time for conversation later. Inside, the church had been transformed overnight. The florists had done beautiful work. White dahlias tied to the end of every pew with loops of cream-colored ribbon. Candles burning in glass holders along the window ledges. The altar dressed in greenery that caught and held the morning light. The stained glass put its colors across the floor and the faces of the people filing in. Blue and gold, and a deep rose that moved slowly as the sun climbed. I stood at the entrance for a moment and breathed it in. Then I saw the chair, front row, left side, aisle seat. A small cream-colored card rested on the cushion, matching the ribbons on the pews. My name was written on it in Lily's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. The same careful hand that had addressed my birthday cards every year without fail since she was old enough to hold a pen steady. Raymond Calloway. 2 words. My name. In the front row of my granddaughter's wedding, in the church where her grandmother and I had made our promises 41 years ago. I walked down the aisle and sat down. And I want to tell you, in that moment, before anything else happened, before Derek arrived, before any of it, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not pride, exactly. Something quieter than pride. Something closer to belonging. Like the world had arranged itself correctly for once. Like someone had looked at the full picture of a man's life and said, yes, this is where he sits. Right here. I sat there and I let myself feel it. For about 20 minutes, I let myself feel it. The guests filled in around me gradually, the way water finds its level. I knew most of them. Millhaven is not a large town, and I have lived here most of my adult life, which means that nearly every face coming through those doors was attached to some memory. A job completed, a favor exchanged, a friendship kept alive through years of chance meetings at the diner or the hardware store or the high school bleachers on Friday nights. I nodded to people as they settled into their pews. Some stopped to shake my hand. Old Phil Hester, who must be close to 80 now, came and sat 2 rows behind me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Finest day, Ray. Finest day." I told him I agreed. Arthur Pennington arrived at 9:40 and took a seat across the aisle, 1 row back. Arthur is a tall man, 6'2", at least with a full head of white hair he's had since his early 50s, and a manner of carrying himself that tells you, without a word spoken, that he has sat in rooms full of powerful people and has not been made smaller by any of them. We had known each other for going on 20 years. He'd been my partner in 3 significant developments and the person I called when I needed to think something through out loud. One of the few people I'd spoken honestly to in the years since Margaret died. He caught my eye when he sat down and gave me a nod. Not the social kind, something more deliberate. The kind of nod that says, "I see you, and I understand what this morning means." I nodded back. By 9:50, the church was nearly full. The organist had begun playing something soft and familiar that rose up into the rafters and stayed there. Outside the tall windows, I could see the October trees moving in a wind that wasn't strong enough to feel cold from inside. It was, by any measure, a perfect morning for a wedding. The kind of morning a bride deserves. And then Derek came in. He entered through the side door near the front, the one that connects to the room where the groomsmen gather before the service. He was moving at his usual pace, which is to say, quickly, with the particular energy of a man who is always managing something. Derek has always been a manager. Even as a boy, he organized things, his toys, his schedules, the games he played with the neighborhood kids. He brought that same quality into business, and it served him well there. What it was less suited for were moments that didn't ask for management, moments that asked for something else entirely. He was accompanied by 4 men I recognized, without knowing well, men who existed at the outer edge of Millhaven's world. Men who came here for business rather than roots. 2 of them I could name. Gerald Fitch, who ran a commercial development firm out of Indianapolis, and Paul Stearns, whose family bank had financed several Callaway construction projects in recent years. The other 2 I knew by sight, without being able to place them. These were Derek's men, the circle he was building the next chapter of the company around. He saw me in the front row, and I watched something move across his face. Not guilt, not embarrassment. Something more like rapid calculation. His eyes went from me to the men behind him and back to me, and I knew, before he crouched beside my chair, what he was going to say. I had known the moment I saw who he'd walked in with. He kept his voice low. He told me he was sorry, that there had been a change in the arrangements, that these gentlemen needed to be in the front row for, and I remember this phrase with a clarity that has not faded in the months since, for relationship reasons. He said he was sure I understood. He said there were perfectly good seats a few rows back. He said all of this in the practiced, frictionless tone of a man who has learned to deliver difficult information without appearing to acknowledge that it is difficult. I looked at him, just for a moment, long enough to see him clearly, not the boy I'd brought to job sites on Saturday mornings, not the young man who'd shaken my hand across my own desk and promised he wouldn't let me down, but the man he had become in this particular moment, in this particular church, on this particular morning. Then I stood up. I took the card with my name on it from the cushion of the chair. I folded it once and placed it in my jacket pocket, against my chest, where it remained for the rest of that day. I did not say anything. I did not raise my voice. I did not do any of the things that the part of me which remembered bleeding into that company for 30 years wanted very badly to do. I walked 3 rows back and found an open seat on the aisle and sat down. The woman beside me, a guest from Thomas's side, I assumed smiled briefly and returned to her program. I folded my hands in my lap. The organist continued playing. The morning light continued moving through the stained glass. The white dahlias were still perfect on the ends of the pews. Nothing had changed, visibly, and everything had changed. I did not turn to look at the front row. I had no need to. I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling into me, the way cold settles into old bones. Not sharp, not sudden, but thorough and patient. The kind of cold that you know will take a long time to leave the body entirely. Across the aisle and 1 row forward, Arthur Pennington was not reading his program. He was looking at the front row, with his jaw set in the particular way it sets when he is working through something that troubles him and has not yet decided what to do about it. I had seen that expression on him before, in conference rooms, across negotiating tables. It was not an expression that preceded inaction. He was not the only one who had seen what happened. Gerald Fitch was now seated in the front row, in the chair that had held my name 10 minutes earlier, and he was looking straight ahead at the altar. But his posture had changed since he came in. It had acquired a stiffness, a slight rigidity in the shoulders that had not been there before. Paul Stearns, seated beside him, was leaning slightly toward the man on his other side, speaking in a low voice. I could not hear the words. I did not need to. These were the men Derek had moved his father to impress, and they were not impressed. Lily came down the aisle at 10 o'clock exactly. She wore her mother's veil ivory, simple, falling to her shoulders and catching the light in a way that made it look as though it belonged to a different era entirely. Which, in a sense, it did. The dress was her own choosing, something she'd found in a shop in Indianapolis, and it suited her the way things only suit people when they've been chosen freely. She carried the white dahlias. Her hair was up, with a few strands loose around her face, the same way Margaret used to wear hers when we were young, and the world still felt like it had more ahead of it than behind. She looked like her grandmother. She always has, around the eyes. The resemblance catches me off guard even when I'm expecting it. I watched her walk down the aisle on her father's arm. I watched the exact moment she looked toward the front row, toward the seat she'd reserved with her own handwriting, and registered that someone else was sitting in it. Her eyes moved quickly across the rows, scanning, and when they found me 3 rows back, I saw something cross her face that she chose deliberately and gracefully not to pursue. She was walking toward Thomas. She was not going to let anything else own that walk, but she found my eyes, and she held them for 2 or 3 steps longer than the natural rhythm of the aisle required. I smiled at her. I meant it completely. She smiled back. She meant it too. Then she was at the altar, and Thomas was reaching for her hand, and Gerald Hooper was opening his book, and the ceremony began the way ceremonies do, with the weight of everything that led to this moment pressing quietly behind every word. I will not tell you everything about the service, because most of it belongs to Lily and Thomas and is not mine to offer. What I will say is that Gerald Hooper's homily was about foundations, about how every visible structure rests on what has been laid beneath it, unseen and unacknowledged, until the day something tests it. I don't know if he selected that theme with me in mind. It's possible, knowing Gerald Hooper. It's equally possible he simply has the gift of finding the right words for the right room without being told what the room needs. Either way, I heard every word of it. The vows were written by Lily and Thomas themselves, which did not surprise me. Thomas's hands trembled slightly when he held hers. I was glad for that. A man who doesn't tremble in that moment isn't fully understanding what he's agreeing to. When the pastor pronounced them married and Thomas kissed his bride, the church filled with that particular sound, not quite applause, not quite laughter. Something between the two that has no precise name, but that every person in every pew understood immediately. I clapped with the rest of them. The card pressed against my ribs through the fabric of my jacket. The recessional was joyful and quick. Lily and Thomas coming back up the aisle hand in hand, their faces open with the specific happiness of people who have just done the most important thing of their lives and know it. As she passed my row, Lily tilted her head slightly toward me and said something to Thomas I couldn't hear. He looked over at me and gave a nod that I recognized as the nod of a man who understands the full situation and has already chosen which side of it he is on. These were good people. They would be fine. The guests moved from the church to the garden for the reception, a gradual and sociable migration through the side doors and out into the October afternoon. The sun had climbed enough to soften the morning chill without eliminating it entirely. Round tables stood under a canopy of white fabric, each centered with dahlias and small lanterns that weren't lit yet, but would be beautiful when they were. A string quartet played near the garden wall. Someone placed a glass of something sparkling in my hand, and I held it and stood near the edge of things and watched the crowd arrange itself into the clusters that always form at these events. The old friendships reconvening, the family constellations consolidating, the business acquaintances finding each other with the particular purposefulness of people who are never entirely off the clock. Derek was in the center of it all. He moved through the garden the way he moved through every room he occupied, with confidence, with momentum, with the bearing of a man who has decided he is the most significant person present. He was working that garden the way he worked every room. Handshakes, leaning in for private exchanges, laughing with precision at the right moments. He was skilled at it. He had always been skilled at it. What I was watching now was whether the people he was performing for were receiving it the way he imagined. Some of them were, but not all. Arthur Pennington stood near the far edge of the garden in conversation with Gerald Fitch. And what was happening between them was not the easy, warm exchange of men enjoying a celebration. Arthur was speaking. Fitch was listening with an expression that was not surprised. It was the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had already begun to suspect. His arms were crossed. He was nodding slowly. He did not look like a man who had just been charmed. I found a chair at a small table near the garden wall, away from the center, out of the primary social current, and I sat down and let the afternoon move around me. A server brought food. I ate without tasting. The quartet shifted to something livelier, and a few of the younger guests drifted toward the small dance floor near the canopy. Lily found me about 40 minutes into the reception. She came alone, which told me she'd made a point of it. She had excused herself from whatever obligations a bride carries in the first hour of her own reception and crossed the garden to where I was sitting. She pulled out the chair beside me and sat down and took both my hands in hers without speaking for a moment. Then she said, "Grandpa, I'm sorry." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said, "That was your seat. I wrote your name on it myself. I told her I knew. I told her I'd kept the card. I told her that the only thing that mattered to me on this day was watching her walk down that aisle toward a man whose hands trembled when he held hers, and that I'd seen everything I needed to see. She laughed, genuinely, not politely. Then she rested her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small and fell asleep during Sunday visits. And I sat there with her hand in mine and thought that whatever this day had cost me, this moment was worth the full price of it. After a moment, she looked up at me with her grandmother's eyes. She said that her father didn't always see things clearly. She said it plainly, the way she says most things. I told her I knew that. She said she believed he loved me, that she was sure of it. I told her I was sure of it too. And I meant it. Love and clarity are not the same thing. And a man can love his father genuinely while still being blind to what that father has meant to the life he's living. That particular blindness is not rare. It was not entirely foreign to me at 41, if I was willing to be honest about it. I had simply hoped Derek would find his way out of it sooner than I had. Lily was called back to the head table. A photograph, a decision the coordinator needed, and she squeezed my hands before she left and promised me a dance before the evening was over. I told her I'd hold her to it. I sat for a while after she left, watching the afternoon settle into the garden. The lanterns on the tables had been lit while we talked, small flames steady in the still air. The October light was going golden now. That low, late afternoon angle that makes everything it touches look more significant than it does at noon. I watched Derek move through it, still working the room, still confident, still unaware. Arthur came and sat across from me sometime in that hour. He poured water from the pitcher on the table and drank it slowly, and then set the glass down and looked at me with the directness I had always valued in him. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. He said he'd seen what happened in the church. I said I'd assumed he had. He was quiet for a moment, the way he gets quiet when he's choosing his words with care. Then he told me that Fitch had seen it too, that Stearns had seen it. I told him I'd noticed. He turned his water glass slowly between his hands. Then he said something I've carried with me since. He said those men had known for years who really built Callaway Construction. They knew who had kept it standing when it needed keeping. They hadn't come to that wedding expecting to watch the man who built it get moved out of his own seat to make room for them. He said that kind of thing follows a man. It attaches itself to his reputation the way rust attaches to metal, quietly, invisibly, and then all at once. He said Derek was smart, but smart and wise were different instruments, and today Derek had demonstrated which one he was still missing. I looked out at the garden, at the lanterns, and the dahlias, and the October light going bronze over everything. Derek was near the bar with his head thrown back, laughing at something, completely at ease. He had no sense at all of what had settled into the room around him over the course of that afternoon. That was the saddest thing about it, not the chair itself, not the card I was carrying next to my heart. The saddest thing was the distance between what Derek believed this day had been and what it actually was. He thought he'd managed something. He thought the afternoon had gone well. He had no idea that the men he'd displaced his father to impress had spent much of the reception being quietly told by a man they trusted more than they trusted Derek exactly who Raymond Callaway was and what Raymond Callaway had done. Arthur said his goodbyes not long after that. I stayed through the first hour of dancing, long enough to keep my promise to Lily. We danced to a slow song, her head against my shoulder, my hand at her back, the two of us moving in a small circle on the edge of the dance floor while the evening came down around the garden. I held her the way you hold something you know is temporary and precious and not entirely yours. When the song ended, she kissed my cheek. I told her I was heading home before the evening got too late. She walked me to my car with her arm through mine. Leaves moving quietly around our feet in the October dark. The lights of the reception warm and distant behind us. She held on for a long time before she let go. I drove home through the dark with the card in my jacket pocket and the evening sitting heavy and quiet all around me. When I got inside, I took the card out and set it on the kitchen table under the light and looked at it for a moment. Raymond Calloway. Lily's handwriting. Careful and deliberate. The way she does everything that matters to her. I opened the hallway drawer, the one where I keep the things I want to hold on to but don't know quite what to do with, and I placed the card inside. Next to the photograph of Margaret from the early years. Next to the letter from my father I've carried since he died. Next to the small wooden cross from my parents' kitchen wall. The things that last. The things that stay. I closed the drawer and went to bed. The next morning was Sunday, and I went to the Methodist church on Birch Street, not the white church on Calloway Road, which I wasn't ready to face again quite so soon. I sat in the back pew among the older congregation and let the service move over me without trying to hold too much of it. Sometimes that's what church is for. Not instruction, just presence. Just the particular quiet of sitting in a room full of people who have also carried things they didn't choose to carry, and finding that the weight is somehow different when you're not carrying it entirely alone. Afterward, I ate breakfast at the diner on Main Street, eggs and toast and coffee, the same order I've placed there since 1992. I sat by the window and watched the Sunday morning traffic on Main Street, which is to say, almost none. And I thought about what came next. I had made a decision the night before, somewhere between the reception and my own front door. A quiet decision, without ceremony. I was going to stop doing the invisible work, not stop loving Derek, not stop caring what happened to the company I built, but stop making the calls that kept the relationships intact, stop scheduling the lunches that smoothed over the frictions, stop being the silent net beneath a man who didn't know the net was there. I had been holding things up from underneath for 3 years, and what I'd understood the previous morning was this: you cannot protect someone from the consequences of who they are indefinitely. Eventually, the protection becomes the obstacle. Eventually, the only thing left to do is step back and let the ground show itself. This was not revenge. I want to be plain about that. Revenge was never something I had much patience for. It takes too much energy, and it leaves you with nothing worth keeping at the end. This was simply the recognition that Derek was 41 years old, and it was time past time for him to find out what the company felt like when the invisible hand was no longer there to steady it. Not because I wanted him to suffer, because I wanted him to see. Because you cannot teach a man something he is not yet in a position to learn, and Derek was not yet in a position to learn it. He needed to be brought to the threshold by something other than my words. I paid my bill. Left a good tip the way my father taught me. And drove home through the quiet Sunday streets. The house was still. The garden outside the back window was stripped nearly bare now, the last of the season letting go without any fuss. I stood at the kitchen window for a while with my second cup of coffee and looked out at it. The oak tree at the back. The empty beds where Margaret's flowers had been. The wooden fence post at the far end where a cardinal sometimes landed in the mornings, though there was none there today. I thought about what was coming. I didn't know the shape of it yet, but I knew it was coming. The way you know weather is coming when you've lived in a place long enough to read the sky correctly. And I knew that when it arrived, when Derek finally ran out of road and turned around and looked back, I would be here. Not in the front row. Not working in the shadows. Just here. In this kitchen. With the coffee on and the door unlocked. The way a father waits for a son who is not yet ready to come home, but will be. November came to Millhaven the way it always does, without asking permission. One morning, the temperature dropped 15 degrees overnight and didn't come back up. And that was that. The last of the leaves were gone from the trees along Birchwood Avenue, leaving the branches bare and dark against a sky that had settled into the flat gray that would be its color now until March. The garden was finished. The days got short fast. I moved my morning coffee back to the kitchen table full time and accepted that the porch was done until spring. I settled into a routine the way men my age do when the outside world quiets down. Carefully, deliberately, one day at a time. I walked in the mornings, down Birchwood to Main Street and back, about 2 miles, which my doctor had told me was enough, and my father's ghost had told me was not nearly enough, but which I had decided was the right compromise between the two of them. I cooked simple meals. I read in the evenings. I called a few old friends on the telephone, men I'd known for decades, men who understood the particular silence that comes with this stage of life, and didn't try to fill it with advice. I did not call Derek, and Derek did not call me. That was not unusual on the surface of it. We had gone longer than 2 weeks without speaking before much longer. In some stretches, when the business was busy and the days collapsed into each other and neither of us thought to pick up the phone. But this silence felt different in quality. It had a texture to it, a weight. The kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, but is instead the accumulation of things that haven't been said, collecting in the space between two people who don't yet know how to say them. I noticed it. I didn't chase it. I had made my decision in the diner on that Sunday morning after the wedding, and I intended to keep it. Not out of stubbornness, or not entirely out of stubbornness, anyway. Because I am my father's son, and stubbornness is not a quality I've ever fully shed. But out of a genuine belief that what was coming needed to come on its own terms, in its own time, without me standing in the road waving it back. So I waited. And in the meantime, I lived my life, which was smaller than it used to be, but not without its satisfactions. There was the garden to prepare for winter, cutting back the dead stalks, turning the soil, spreading the mulch. There was the hardware store on Main Street, where I still spent more time than was strictly necessary, talking to the owner's son about nothing in particular and everything in general. There was the Methodist church on Sunday mornings and the diner afterward, and the slow, pleasant rhythms of a life that had shed its urgencies and found something quieter on the other side of them. It was in the 3rd week of November that I first heard something was wrong at the company. It didn't come to me directly. It came the way things come in a small town, sideways, through conversation, through the particular way someone hesitates before changing the subject. I was at the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, looking at weather stripping I didn't particularly need, when the owner's son mentioned that he'd heard Callaway Construction had lost the Fort Wayne contract, the commercial development deal Derek had mentioned to me on the phone in September, the one that had sounded promising, the one Derek had talked about with the confidence of a man who considered it already done. I asked him where he'd heard that. He shrugged and said he'd run into one of the Kowalski brothers at the gas station and it had come up. He said he'd figured I already knew. He said it with the careful neutrality of a man who realizes, midway through a sentence, that he may have said more than the situation called for. I told him I appreciated him mentioning it and bought the weather stripping I didn't need and drove home. I sat at the kitchen table for a while with my coat still on, thinking. The Fort Wayne contract was significant. It was the kind of contract that doesn't come along often, a long-term commercial development arrangement that would have provided stable revenue for 2 or 3 years and opened doors to similar work in the region. Derek had been pursuing it for months. Losing it was not a small thing. I thought about calling him. I picked up the phone twice. Both times, I set it back down. I had made a decision. And the decision was not about punishing Derek. It was about letting the truth arrive at his door on its own, instead of through me. The truth was apparently already on its way. My job now was to stay out of its path. I took my coat off and made dinner and went to bed, but I didn't sleep particularly well that night. I lay in the dark and thought about the company, about the bones of it, the structure I'd built over 30 years, all the decisions and relationships and carefully maintained trust that had gone into making it what it was. I thought about what happens to a structure when the foundation shifts, how the first signs are always subtle. A small crack in a corner, a door that doesn't hang quite right. Easy to ignore if you don't know what you're looking for. Impossible to ignore once you do. I knew what I was looking for, and I was fairly certain that Derek, as yet, did not. December arrived, and the silence between Derek and me held. I learned things in pieces. The way you learn things in a small town when you're paying attention without asking directly. The Fort Wayne contract had indeed fallen through, not because of any dramatic failure, but because of the quiet withdrawal of confidence that happens when the people at the table aren't entirely sure the man across from them has what they need. I heard, through Arthur, that Gerald Fitch had declined to move forward on a potential partnership that had been in early discussion. The reason given was vague. The real reason, as Arthur explained it to me over the phone one evening, was that Fitch had come away from the wedding with a question he hadn't been able to answer to his own satisfaction. A question about the character of the man he'd be tying his business to. I listened to Arthur tell me this, and I felt something that was not satisfaction. Exactly. It was more complicated than satisfaction. It was the particular feeling of watching something you predicted come true and wishing, even so, that you had been wrong. I told Arthur I appreciated him keeping me informed. He said, "Ray, at some point, the boy is going to need to hear some things from someone he trusts." He paused. "I'm going to have that conversation with him. I wanted you to know before I did." I told him I thought that was the right thing to do. He said, "He may not take it well at first." I said I expected he wouldn't. There was a silence on the line, comfortable in the way that silences between old friends can be. Then Arthur said, "You doing all right out there?" I told him I was doing fine, and it was mostly true. The days were short and the house was quiet, and I was fine. Arthur had his conversation with Derek in the second week of December. He told me afterward that it had gone more or less the way we'd both expected. He'd asked Derek to meet him for lunch at the restaurant on the far end of Main Street, the nicer one, the kind of place where serious conversations happen because the tables are far enough apart that no one overhears anything. He'd told Derek what he'd seen at the wedding. Not as an accusation, Arthur was too skilled for accusation, but as an observation from someone who had been watching the situation for a long time and believed Derek deserved to have it named clearly. He told Derek that the men in the front row had noticed, that Fitch had noticed, that Stearns had noticed. He told Derek that in their world, a man who moves his own father out of a seat to make room for a business contact is not a man those contacts feel secure building a future with. He said it plainly, and he let it land. Derek, according to Arthur, had not responded well initially. He'd pushed back, said Arthur was reading too much into a seating arrangement, said the decisions at the wedding were complicated, said he didn't see how one moment in a church could affect a business relationship. He said it with the confidence of a man who has not yet been shown sufficient evidence to abandon a position he finds comfortable. Arthur let him talk. When Derek finished, Arthur said something brief. He said, "Derek, your father built every important relationship this company has. Every single one. And the men in that room knew it before you moved him." He picked up his glass. The question isn't whether they noticed. The question is what you're going to do now that you know they did. He told me Derek had gone quiet after that, had sat with his water glass and said very little for the rest of the lunch, had thanked Arthur when they parted ways with something in his face that Arthur described as the expression of a man who has just been told something he already knew but had been working very hard not to know. That expression, Arthur said, was the beginning of something. I thanked him for telling me. After I hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair by the window, the green one she'd had reupholstered, and looked out at the December street. The light was almost gone by 4 in the afternoon now, the sky turning dark blue over the rooftops across the way. Someone had put Christmas lights in their window. They blinked slowly in the dusk. I thought about Derek sitting in that restaurant with the thing Arthur had said settling into him. I thought about what it feels like to have a certainty you've built your world on start to shift. How disorienting it is. How the first instinct is always to push back, to defend the ground you're standing on, even as you feel it moving under you. I had been there myself, not at 41, but not much later. I knew the feeling. I hoped he'd find his way through it faster than I had. Christmas came and went quietly. Derek called on Christmas morning. It was the first time we'd spoken since the wedding. Nearly 3 months of silence ended by the simple obligation of the holiday, which has a way of cutting through even the most stubborn estrangements. The call was not long. We talked about Lily and Thomas, who were spending Christmas in Vermont with Thomas's family. We talked about the weather. He asked if I was getting out enough. I told him I was walking every morning. He said that was good. He did not mention the company. He did not mention the wedding. He did not mention Arthur. But there was something different in his voice. Something that hadn't been there in our calls before the wedding. A quality I couldn't name precisely. Not quite humility, not quite uncertainty, but something in that direction. Something that suggested the certainty that had always characterized his speech had developed a hairline fracture somewhere, and he was being careful around it. I noticed it, and I didn't press it. I told him Merry Christmas. He told me the same. We hung up, and I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment in the kitchen. The small Christmas tree I'd put up on the counter, blinking behind me. And I thought, he's getting there. Slowly. But he's getting there. January was hard on the company. I didn't hear this through the grapevine. I heard it from Derek himself, in a phone call in the 3rd week of January that he initiated on a Tuesday evening, which told me something about its seriousness. Derek did not make evening calls unless something was pressing on him. He told me that 2 more contracts had fallen through. One of them was a school renovation project in the county that Callaway Construction had been in line for, had, in fact, been the presumed front-runner for, before the school board had quietly selected another firm. The other was a smaller residential development that had simply gone cold without explanation. He told me that one of the Kowalski brothers had called to say they were reconsidering their subcontracting arrangement and wanted to discuss terms before the spring season. He said all of this in a measured voice, the voice he used when he was reporting rather than feeling. But underneath the reporting voice, I could hear something else, a tightness, a careful containment, like a man holding himself very still because he's not entirely sure what will happen if he moves. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him what he thought was behind it. Not what I thought, what he thought. There was a pause. A longer one than the question warranted if the answer were simple. He said he wasn't entirely sure. He said the market was difficult. He said there had been some personnel issues internally. He said a few things that were true and a few things that were the kind of true that is also a way of not saying the thing you're actually thinking. I let it go. The time for the real conversation was coming. It wasn't quite here yet. I told him the Kowalski brothers were worth keeping. I told them to take whatever terms they needed on the subcontracting arrangement, because those relationships were older than the current difficulties and worth more than they appeared on a balance sheet. He said he'd keep that in mind. I could tell he was writing it down. After we hung up, I went to the window and stood there in the dark January evening, looking out at the empty street. The Christmas lights were gone from the neighbor's window. Everything looked bare and waiting in the way that January always looks, stripped down, patient, neither ending nor beginning, but holding the space between. I thought about the Kowalski brothers. I thought about the school board contract. I thought about Gerald Fitch and Paul Stearns, and what Arthur had told Derek over lunch in December. I thought about the invisible architecture of relationships and trust that I had spent 30 years constructing. Beam by beam, handshake by handshake. And what happens to a building when the person maintaining it stops showing up? It doesn't collapse all at once. That's not how buildings fail. Not real ones, and not the kind I'm talking about. They fail gradually. A weakness here, a gap there. Each one small enough to dismiss until enough of them accumulate in the same structure. And then one day, you walk in and the ceiling is not where it was. Derek was walking around inside that building right now, feeling the floor shift, not yet able to identify the source. He would find it. I believed that, but he needed to find it himself. February brought the hardest news. Arthur called me on a Thursday morning. I remember because I was in the middle of making bread, something I'd taken up in the winter months as a way of filling the hours, and because Margaret had always made bread on Thursdays, and the smell of it in the house still felt like company. I had flour on my hands when I answered. Arthur told me that a major municipal contract, a road infrastructure project in the county, that Callaway Construction had been awarded the previous spring, one of the largest single contracts the company had ever held, was under review. The county commissioner's office had received complaints about project timeline delays and had initiated a formal review process. Nothing had been decided. But the review was real, and the contract was at risk. I set down the phone for a moment and looked at my hands. The flour, the kitchen, the bread dough on the counter waiting to be shaped. I thought about the morning 30 years ago when I'd driven out to the county commissioner's office for the first time. In the borrowed truck, with my proposal and a manila folder on the seat beside me. I thought about how long it had taken to earn that kind of trust. How many years? How many jobs done right and promises kept, and early mornings and late evenings, and all the small, invisible work that accumulates over decades into something that people call a reputation. I picked the phone back up. Arthur was still talking. He said the timeline delays were real. There had been management decisions made internally that had stretched the project beyond its original schedule. Decisions Derek had made without fully consulting the project leads who'd flagged the risks. He said he'd tried to get word to Derek through channels, but Derek had been operating with a confidence that had, for a period, made him resistant to input he hadn't asked for. I told Arthur I understood. He said, "Ray, I think he's ready to hear it now. From you. I think he's reached the point where he knows something is fundamentally wrong and he doesn't have the full picture of what it is." I said I thought he might be right. He said, "He's going to call you. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but he's going to call." I told Arthur I'd be here when he did. After the call, I went back to the bread. I shaped it and put it in the pan and slid it into the oven and set the timer and sat down at the kitchen table while it baked. The house filled slowly with the smell of it, yeasty and warm. The most domestic smell in the world. The smell of Margaret's Thursdays. The smell of a house that is lived in by someone who has decided to keep living in it with intention. I thought about Derek, not with anger. That had been gone for a while now. Not because I'd forced it out, but because it had simply run its course. the way anger does when there's no new fuel being added to it. What I felt now was something more like the particular tenderness you feel for someone you love who is in the process of learning something painful and necessary. The tenderness of a father watching a son find his way to the door through a dark room. Moving carefully, hands out, getting closer. I thought about the leather chair in the office, the one I'd sat in for 25 years, the one I'd handed over to Derek when I stepped down. I wondered if he still had it, or if he'd replaced it with something newer, something that matched the image he'd been building of himself. I hadn't been in that office since the handover. I'd made a point of staying away from it, the way you stay away from a place that used to be yours, because the presence of you there makes it harder for the next person to make it theirs. I wondered if I'd been wrong about that. I wondered if absence, in some contexts, is not the gift you think it is. The timer went off. I took the bread out of the oven and set it on the rack to cool, and stood there in the kitchen in the February afternoon, looking at it, thinking that the simplest things are sometimes the most sustaining. The smell of bread, the sound of a timer, the knowledge that you are here, in this house, with the door unlocked, and that the people who need to find you know where you live. He came on a Thursday evening in the last week of February. I didn't know he was coming. He hadn't called ahead, which was unlike him. Derek had always been a man who scheduled things, who arrived with agendas, who prepared for conversations the way he prepared for meetings. Showing up unannounced at his father's house on a winter evening was not his way of doing things, which told me, before I even opened the door, that something had shifted. I heard the car in the driveway at about 7:30. I was in the living room with a book I wasn't reading, the evening news on the television at a volume low enough not to intrude. On the quiet I'd been sitting in. I heard the engine cut off and then nothing for a moment longer than it takes a person to get out of a car and walk to a door. He sat in the driveway for a while. I didn't go to the window to look. I just sat and waited. When the knock came, it was quieter than I expected. Not tentative, exactly. More deliberate. The knock of a man who has made up his mind to do something hard and is doing it before he can talk himself out of it. I set the book down and went to the door. Derek stood on the porch in his coat, the February cold coming in around him when I opened the door. He looked like himself and also not quite like himself. The same face, the same build, but something different in the way he was holding it. The clipboard energy was gone. He looked like a man who had put something down that he'd been carrying for a long time and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. I told him to come in. He came in, and I closed the door behind him, and we stood in the hallway for a moment, in the particular awkwardness of two people who have not spoken honestly in a very long time, and are standing at the threshold of doing so. I asked if he wanted coffee. He said, "Yes, please," which was the right answer, not because I needed to make coffee, but because the making of it gave us both something to do while we moved from the hallway to the kitchen, which is where real conversations happen in this house. It always has been. I put the coffee on, and he sat down at the kitchen table, not at the end where I usually sit, but at the side, which struck me as significant in a way I didn't analyze too closely. He took his coat off and folded it over the back of the chair. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at me. He said, "Dad, I need to talk to you." I said I was listening. He talked for a long time. He told me about the contracts, about the Kowalski brothers, about the municipal review, and what had led to the timeline delays and the decisions he'd made that he now understood differently than he had when he made them. He talked about Fitch, and about the conversation with Arthur in December, and about the things Arthur had said that he'd pushed back on in the moment, but that had been sitting in him ever since, growing heavier rather than lighter, the way true things do when you try to set them aside. and then he stopped talking about the business. He looked at me across the kitchen table, across the same table where he'd sat as a boy and done his homework, and argued about his curfew, and eaten 10,000 meals, and he said, "I didn't understand what you were doing. After you stepped back, I didn't know." He paused. "Arthur told me some of it, about the calls you made, the Pennington dinner, the Kowalski situation, years ago." He stopped again. "How long were you doing that?" I told him the whole time. He absorbed that. His jaw moved slightly in the way it does when he's processing something that requires him to rebuild a structure he thought was already finished. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said, "And I moved you out of your seat." He didn't say it as an accusation of himself. Exactly. He said it as a man saying a thing out loud for the first time that he has understood privately for a while, confirming its reality by giving it words. I didn't respond immediately. I poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him and sat down across the table and wrapped my hands around my own cup the way I do when I'm thinking carefully. The kitchen was quiet. The February wind moved against the windows. The bread I'd baked that morning was still on the counter, more than half gone because I'd eaten several slices through the day, the way I always do when I bake slowly, without planning to, just cutting off a piece each time I pass. I looked at my son across the table, and I said, "Derek, tell me what you actually came here to say." He looked at me for a moment with something in his face that I hadn't seen there in years. Something young, something that predated the company and the title, and the confidence that had accumulated over 2 decades of success. Something that went all the way back to the boy who'd come to job sites with me on Saturday mornings and asked questions about everything he saw. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for the chair. I'm sorry for all of it." The wind moved against the windows again. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and stopped. I looked at my son for a long moment. At the man he was and the man he was working his way back toward being. At the space between those two things, which was smaller than it had been an hour ago, and would be smaller still if we did this right. Then I stood up. I went to the counter and I took the bread knife and I cut 2 thick slices from what was left of the loaf and put them on a plate and set the plate between us on the table. I sat back down. I picked up my coffee. I said, "All right." Just that. All right. 2 words. The same weight as forgiveness, and meaning exactly that and nothing less. Derek looked at the bread and then at me, and something moved through his face that I won't try to describe because some things don't improve when you put them into language. He picked up his coffee cup. I picked up mine. We sat at the kitchen table in the February dark, and we talked, really talked, the way we hadn't talked in years, maybe ever. And outside, the wind moved through the bare trees, and the night settled in around the house. And inside, it was warm and bright and smelled like bread. And that was enough. That was more than enough. March came in soft that year. Not the hard March I was used to in Millhaven. The one that arrives with a final cruelty of cold and ice before it eventually relents. But a gentle one, almost apologetic. As though the winter had said what it needed to say, and was ready now to let something else take its place. The temperature climbed into the 40s by the second week and stayed there. The ground began to soften. I could see the first tentative suggestions of green at the edges of Margaret's garden beds. Not flowers yet, just the earliest indication that something underneath was still alive and beginning to move again. I noticed it on my morning walks, the way you notice things when you've been paying attention to the world for a long time. Not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of recognition. Yes, there it is, right on schedule. The way things come back when you give them enough time and enough space. And you don't make the mistake of digging them up before they're ready. The morning after Derek's visit, I woke early, as I always do, and lay in bed for a while before getting up. The room was still gray with the early light. The house was quiet around me. I could hear the wind in the eaves softer than it had been the night before, something taken out of it overnight. The way the air sometimes gentles itself between one day and the next, as though it too has decided to try a different approach. I thought about what had happened at the kitchen table, not analyzing it exactly. More the way you turn something over in your hands after you've been holding it for a long time, just to see it from a different angle. Derek had sat across from me and said the words and meant them. I had said, "All right," and meant that too. And somewhere in the space between those two things, something had changed. Something fundamental. Something that had been calcified for long enough that I'd stopped expecting it to soften. But it had softened. That's the thing about forgiveness that people don't always understand. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic event. It doesn't announce itself with any particular fanfare. It's more like a change in the quality of the air in a room. You can't point to the exact moment it shifted. But at some point, you notice that you're breathing differently than you were before. The weight is the same, but it sits differently on you. And that difference, small as it seems, changes everything about how you move through the day. I was breathing differently. I got up and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window the way I do every morning, looking out at the yard and the garden and the oak tree and the fence post where the cardinal sometimes lands. The world outside looked exactly as it had looked the day before, but something in the way I was looking at it had changed something in me that received the morning differently now than it had 24 hours ago. Derek had stayed until nearly 10 o'clock. We'd talked, really talked, for the first time in what felt like years, though I suppose it had been years. We talked about the company and what had gone wrong and what could be done about it. But we also talked about other things, about Margaret, about the early years when the three of us were a household, and the house was loud with the particular noise of a family that is always in motion. About a Saturday in 1991, when Derek was 8 years old and had helped me pour a foundation for the first time, and had been so proud of himself that he'd called his grandmother from the job site to tell her about it, using the mobile phone the size of a brick that I carried in those days. I hadn't thought about that Saturday in years. Derek had remembered it in detail. That's when I knew the boy was still in there. The man hadn't buried him as deeply as I'd feared. We hadn't solved everything in one evening. You don't undo years in an evening. But you can open a door in an evening. And we had opened a door. And that was the beginning of everything that came after. The coffee was ready. I poured a cup and went back to the window and stood there in the early morning light, thinking about what needed to happen next, not just for the company, though the company was part of it, but for the two of us, for Derek and me, for the relationship that had been operating at a distance for so long that we'd both started to mistake the distance for the natural order of things. It was not the natural order of things. It was just what happens when two people who don't know how to talk to each other stop trying. We had tried last night. We could try again tomorrow, and the day after that. That was enough to start with. The first thing I did that morning was call Arthur, not to report what had happened. Arthur was not a man who needed to be debriefed. I called because he had been part of this from the beginning, had seen what I had seen, and done what needed doing. And it felt right to let him know that the thing he'd started with that lunch in December had found its way to where it needed to go. He answered on the second ring. I told him Derek had come by the previous evening. I told him we'd talked. There was a silence on the line, and then he said, "Good." Just that one word. But he said it in a way that carried the full weight of everything behind it. The wedding, the months of watching, the lunch at the restaurant on Main Street, all of it compressed into a single word by a man who understood that sometimes one word is exactly the right amount. Then he asked what I needed from him. I told him I needed him to be patient with Derek while he found his footing again. That what Derek needed now was not more correction, but space to demonstrate he'd heard what he'd been told. Arthur said he'd already been thinking along those lines. He asked if I was going to get involved with the company again. The truth was I'd been thinking about it all morning. Going back to the shadows, doing what I'd done for 3 years. Holding things up from beneath, without anyone knowing, was not the answer. That approach had protected Derek from consequences he needed to experience. It had allowed him to build a version of himself that had never been fully tested. I didn't want to go back to that. But complete withdrawal wasn't right either. The company had real problems. And some of those problems required relationships and knowledge that I had, and Derek was still developing. I told Arthur I was thinking about going back to the office. Not as chairman, not in any official capacity that would confuse the lines of authority, but as a presence, visible, acknowledged, open. No more invisible work. If I helped, it would be help that Derek knew about and could learn from. The kind of help that builds a person rather than building a ceiling above him. Arthur said that sounded about right. I told him I was also going to call Gerald Fitch. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what I was going to say to him. I told him I wasn't going to say anything directly about the wedding or about Derek. I was going to invite him to lunch, and I was going to be exactly who I had always been. Raymond Calloway, the man who built Calloway Construction, the man whose word meant something in this part of the state. And I was going to let Fitch draw his own conclusions about what it meant that Raymond Calloway was back at the table. Arthur made a sound that might have been a laugh. He said I hadn't changed a bit. I told him I'd changed plenty. I just hadn't changed the parts that mattered. I called Gerald Fitch that afternoon. He answered with a wariness in his voice that told me he'd seen my name on the screen and taken a moment to decide. But he picked up. He picked up because there was still a part of him that understood who he was picking up for. I invited him to lunch the following week. I kept it brief and simple and didn't explain more than was necessary, because I've never believed in explaining more than is necessary. He said yes without hesitating too long. Thursday worked for him. I told him Thursday worked for me, too. When I hung up, I felt something I recognized from a long time ago, from the early years, when every phone call was a step forward into territory I was still mapping. The feeling of motion, of things beginning to move in the right direction after a long period of being still. It was a good feeling. I'd missed it more than I'd been willing to admit. Derek came back the following Saturday morning. This time he called ahead, which was itself a signal, some basic courtesy of relationship restored, something that had been quietly missing for a while. He arrived at 8:30 with a folder of documents under his arm, and we sat at the kitchen table and worked through the company situation the way I used to work through problems in the early years, methodically, without panic, identifying what was real and what was manageable and what could wait. He had the current numbers, I had the history. Between the two of us, we had a reasonably complete picture. The municipal contract review was the most pressing concern. The county commissioner's office had scheduled a formal meeting for the following month. It was recoverable, I could see that, but it would require more than a polished plan on paper. It would require the presence across the table of someone whose word the decision-makers trusted. I told him I wanted to go to that meeting with him. He looked up from the documents. He said, "With me." I said with him, not instead of him. His name on the door, his voice making the case, his accountability for what had gone wrong. But my presence beside him, visible and acknowledged, saying without words that the man who built this company stands behind the man running it. He asked how I knew that would read the right way. I told him because I knew the people who would be sitting across that table. They weren't looking for perfection. They were looking for accountability and the reasonable assurance that what went wrong was understood and wouldn't be repeated. The best way to provide that assurance wasn't with a polished presentation. It was with the truth, delivered by the right people. Derek nodded slowly. He said, "All right." He said it the way I had said it to him in February, quietly, with the full weight of what it meant behind the words. We kept working through the documents. At some point, I made more coffee and scrambled eggs because it was past 10 and neither of us had eaten. And Derek ate at my kitchen table the way he used to eat there when he was young, without ceremony. Comfortable in the way you're only comfortable in a place that has always been safe. That was when I knew we were going to be all right. Not the company, though. The company was going to be all right, too. I mean, the two of us, father and son, at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with eggs and coffee and papers spread between them, doing the work together. This was what I had always wanted it to look like. I just hadn't known how to say so, and Derek hadn't known how to ask. Some things take longer than they should. That's the truth of it. But they can still get there. That's the other truth. The one worth holding on to. The lunch with Gerald Fitch went the way those things go when you don't complicate them. I went in as myself with nothing to sell and nothing to hide. Just the accumulated weight of 30 years of being the person I am. I told him directly that the company was going through a correction and that Derek was leading it with my full support. I told him the values hadn't changed, the standards hadn't changed. Some of the execution had gotten ahead of the foundation, and we were bringing the foundation back in line. By the end of the meal, he hadn't made any commitments, but he'd said he was open to revisiting the partnership conversation. In Fitch's vocabulary, that was as close to yes as he typically allowed himself on a first pass. The county commissioners' meeting came in the third week of April. Derek and I drove there together in his car. It was his company, his meeting, his car. I was the passenger, which was the correct arrangement. We walked in together and sat down together, and Derek made his presentation. Honest, thorough, accepting responsibility without deflection or excuse. And then he introduced me, and I said a few words about the history of our relationship with the county and what I believed about where the company was heading. The meeting lasted 2 hours. At the end of it, the commissioner told us the contract would be maintained with a modified oversight structure and a revised timeline. She shook both our hands. When she shook mine, she said she was glad to see me back in the room. I told her it was good to be back. In the car afterward, Derek drove for a long while without speaking. We were back on Callaway Road, the spring fields opening on either side. The trees in that particular urgent green of April that always looks slightly too bright, as though the color hasn't quite settled into itself yet. He said, "Thank you, Dad." I told him it was what family does. He didn't say anything to that, but I saw his jaw move the way it does when something has landed, and he's choosing to hold it carefully rather than let it go. We drove the rest of the way in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, the kind that belongs to people who have said the important things and are comfortable now with what the quiet contains between them. May arrived, and with it, a slow turning of the tide. The Kowalski brothers confirmed their subcontracting arrangement for the spring season after a meeting that Derek handled himself, without me, which was exactly as it should have been. He called me afterward, and in the way he talked about it, I could hear the difference. Less performance, more substance. The difference between a man describing something he's managed and a man describing something he genuinely understands. Arthur called to tell me Paul Stearns had reached out about a potential financing arrangement. Early stage, nothing committed yet, but Stearns had made the call. I told Arthur to pass it to Derek. that it was Derek's conversation to have. Arthur said I had more patience than any man he'd ever known. I told him patience was easier when you'd already seen how the story turned out. Lily came home in the middle of May. She arrived on a Thursday, which meant she came through the front door to the smell of bread baking in the oven. And she announced in the hallway that this was the best thing that had ever happened to her. She came in and dropped her bag and went straight to the kitchen and cut herself a thick slice before she'd even taken her coat off, which made me happier than I can adequately explain. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for a long time. She told me about Indianapolis and the apartment and Thomas's work and the small balcony garden she was trying to coax into existence. She was happy in the real way, the kind that doesn't need to perform itself for anyone. I could see it in the way she sat, the way she talked, the ease of a person who has landed in the right life and knows it. At some point, she asked about her father. She said things had felt different since February. She didn't know exactly what had happened. Neither Derek nor I had told her the details, and I wasn't going to, but she could feel the change in him. She said he seemed lighter, that he'd called her twice in March just to talk, with no particular reason, which she said was so unlike him that the first time it happened, she'd spent the opening minutes of the call waiting for him to get to his point before she realized that talking to her was the point. I told her I was glad to hear it. She looked at me across the table and asked what had happened between us after the wedding. I told her Derek had come to see me and we'd talked and figured some things out. I said that was really all there was to it. She gave me the look that told me she knew there was considerably more to it than that, but that she also understood I wasn't going to say more, and that she was going to respect that. Then she said she was glad. Really glad. I told her I was too. She stayed for dinner, and we cooked together the way Margaret and I used to cook on Sunday evenings, moving around each other without getting in each other's way, handing things back and forth without having to ask. She was a better cook than I was by a fair margin, which I told her. She said she'd learned from watching me, which I didn't entirely believe, but appreciated nonetheless. Before she left, she held me by the shoulders on the front porch and looked at me in the direct way she has and said I looked like myself. I told her I felt like myself. She smiled, the full one, the real one, the one that has been the same since she was 4 years old, and drove away down Callaway Road in the May evening with one arm out the open window, the way young people do when the weather has finally decided to be generous. I sat on the porch after she left and watched the light go gold over the trees along Birchwood Avenue, and thought about Arthur's dinner, which was coming the following week. He'd invited me without asking my opinion about whether I wanted the head of the table, which was characteristic of him. I'd told him I'd be there. Arthur's dinner was on a Friday evening in late May at his house on the east side of Millhaven, a large, well-kept place behind old elm trees that had somehow outlasted everything that had taken the other elms from the rest of the town. 8 of us around the table: Arthur and Carolyn, Gerald Fitch up from Indianapolis, the Kowalski brothers, both of them, which was a rarer sight at a social occasion than I'd have liked, Helen Marsh from the county planning office, and Derek. Derek was already there when I arrived, talking to Caroline in the living room, and when he looked up, I saw something in his face that had been missing for too long. The ease of a man who has put down a mask he'd worn so consistently, he'd stopped noticing its weight. He came over and shook my hand, and then pulled me into the kind of brief embrace that men of our background don't do easily, which means exactly that it doesn't come easily. And that is precisely what makes it mean something. Arthur had put me at the head of the table. I sat down without making a production of it, simply sat, and accepted it the way you accept something offered honestly, gracefully, and without false modesty. Because false modesty is just vanity wearing a different coat. The dinner was long and good. Gerald Fitch talked about his family. The Kowalski brothers argued cheerfully about something I didn't fully follow, but which they clearly enjoyed arguing about. Helen Marsh told a story about a planning commission meeting that brought the whole table to laughter. Arthur kept the wine moving. Caroline kept everything else moving. And Derek sat across from me at the other end of the table, looking, for the first time in years, like a man who was genuinely present in the room he was occupying, rather than performing for it. During the main course, Gerald Fitch set his fork down and looked at me and said, without preamble, "Ray, I owe you an apology." The table quieted. I told him he didn't owe me anything. He said he did. He said he'd watched what happened at the wedding and said nothing. And that wasn't good enough from a man who considered himself a friend. He said he'd let his business instincts override his human instincts, and he wasn't proud of it. I told him I understood it. I told him I didn't hold it against him. He nodded and picked up his fork. He said, "Well, I'm glad you're back at the table, Raymond." I looked around that table, at Arthur, watching with the expression of a man whose careful work has produced the result he intended. At the Kowalski brothers, raising their glasses in a small, wordless salute. At Helen Marsh, smiling with the warmth of someone who has lived in a place long enough to understand what she is witnessing. At Derek, at the far end of the table, looking at me with something in his eyes I had not seen there since he was a boy, watching his father do something he didn't yet have the words for. I said, "It's good to be back." And it was. It genuinely was. After dinner, Derek found me near the bookcase in the corner, where I'd stopped to read the spines the way I always do in other people's houses. He stood beside me, and we both looked at the shelves for a moment without speaking. Then, he said he wanted to show me something at the office, next week, if I could make it. I asked what he wanted to show me. He said he'd rather show me than describe it. I told him I'd come Tuesday morning. We stood there a moment longer, two men at a bookshelf at the end of a good evening, comfortable in the proximity of each other in a way that had not been available to us for a very long time. He said, quietly, "I'm glad you came tonight, Dad." I told him I wouldn't have missed it. Tuesday morning, I drove to the office for the first time in 3 years. The building looked the same, 2 stories of brick on the commercial side of Millhaven, with the Callaway construction sign above the entrance, letters clean and well-maintained. The parking lot freshly resurfaced. Someone had planted something along the front walkway that was just coming into bloom. Small details, but they told you the place was being cared for by someone who paid attention to small details. And small details are how you know what a person is actually like. Derek was waiting at the entrance. He held the door, which I let him do. Inside, the office smelled the way it always had, coffee and paper, and the particular neutral atmosphere of a working space that has found its rhythm. The young woman at the reception desk greeted me by name, which meant Derek had told her I was coming, and thought about how that should look. He walked me through the main floor the way you walk someone through a place you're genuinely proud of, not performatively, just with the ease of a person showing something real to someone whose opinion matters. The project management system was better organized than anything we'd had in my time. The conference room whiteboard was covered in notes from a recent session. Evidence of a company being run thoughtfully by someone who had learned, the hard way, to pay attention to the right things. Then he took me upstairs to the main office, and there was the leather chair. He hadn't replaced it. It was still behind the desk, exactly where I'd left it when I handed the office over 3 years before. The dark brown leather was more worn than it had been, shaped further by the years of use. But it was the same chair. The one I'd bought in the 90s, the one I'd sat in when I signed the first major contract, when I made the decisions that shaped what the company became, when I shook Derek's hand across that desk and told him it was his. I stopped when I saw it. Derek said he'd thought about getting a new one a few times. He said he kept deciding not to. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just looked at the chair. He said he knew it was just furniture. I told him it wasn't just furniture. He said he knew. We stood there for a moment in the quiet of that office, the spring light coming through the windows, the sounds of the building working below us, the particular silence of a room that holds a lot of history and knows it. Then Derek said there was something he wanted to ask me. He said he'd been thinking about the structure of the company, about decision-making, about who was involved, about the institutional knowledge and relationship history that couldn't be captured in any document or replicated by any new hire. He said he thought there was a real role, not an honorary one, not a title without substance, for someone who brought all of that. Someone whose involvement would be visible and acknowledged, not hidden in the background. He said he wanted that to be me, if I was willing. I looked at my son standing in the office that had once been mine, asking me to come back in the right way, not to take over. Not to disappear into the shadows again, but to be present and visible and acknowledged for what I was and what I had given. I thought about the card in the hallway drawer at home, about the chair with my name on it, about the February night at the kitchen table and the bread, and the two words that had opened a door neither of us had known how to open. I said yes. I was willing. Derek's shoulders dropped slightly. The release of tension held so long the body has forgotten it was holding it. He looked at the leather chair and then back at me. He asked if I wanted to sit down. I looked at the chair behind the desk. Then I looked at the chair on the visitor's side. I told him to sit in his chair. I took the visitor's chair. He looked at me. I told him it was his desk, his company. I was here to help him run it, not to run it for him. That was the whole point, and we both needed to be clear about it. Every time I walked through that door. He sat down in the leather chair. I sat across from him. The morning light lay across the desk between us, warm and ordinary and exactly right. That was how the new arrangement began. Not with ceremony, not with paperwork or titles or announcements. Just two men sitting across a desk from each other on a Tuesday morning in late May, ready to do the work. The morning after that I came back, and the morning after that, and I sat in the visitor's chair across from my son, and the chair stopped being the visitor's chair and became something else. The chair where Raymond Calloway sat when he came in to do what still needed doing, which was, most days. It wasn't the front row. It wasn't the head of any table, but it was where I belonged. And everyone in that building knew it. The people in the hallways, the project managers, the young woman at the reception desk who greeted me by name every morning. They all knew. You can move a man out of a chair. You cannot move him out of that knowing. You cannot relocate a person's meaning in a place, no matter how many seats you rearrange. Lily had always understood that. Arthur had understood it for years, and now Derek understood it too. On the first Saturday of June, Lily came back to Millhaven, this time with Thomas. They arrived in the late morning, Thomas carrying good coffee from a shop in Indianapolis he'd decided was worth transporting 60 miles, which told me something useful about his character. Derek and Sandra arrived an hour later. Lily had organized the whole thing, called me 2 weeks before, asked if she could handle the food, negotiated the details with the easy efficiency of a woman who knows how to get things done without making anyone feel managed. I had set the table in the dining room, not the kitchen, the dining room, which I hadn't used for a proper family meal since the Christmas before Margaret died. The long oak table she'd picked out in 1992 at a furniture store in Fort Wayne, driving 45 minutes each way because she'd seen it in a catalog and decided it was exactly right, and was willing to go and find it regardless of the distance. She had been right. She was usually right about things like that. It was a table built to hold people for a long time, with chairs that invited staying and a solidity that told you, without a word, that the people around it were expected to remain. I'd put the white linen cloth on it from the cabinet where Margaret kept the good things, the one opened only for Christmas and Easter and the dinner parties that mattered. I'd cut some flowers from the garden, the early June things that had come up through everything I'd done to keep the beds alive through the winter, and set them in a vase at the center of the table. It looked the way it was supposed to look. Lily stopped in the doorway when she saw it. She stood there for a moment with her hand over her mouth, not in distress, but in recognition. The way you look at something you didn't know you'd been missing until it appears in front of you. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around me and held on. And I held on too, and neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed saying. We had lunch around that table, all 6 of us, 3 generations of the Calloway family, and the man who had joined it and was becoming part of it in the slow, organic way that good things happen when you don't force them. The food was what Lily had brought and made, which was better than anything I would have produced. The coffee was Thomas's, which was worth the 60 miles. The conversation moved the way conversation moves when everyone at the table is genuinely glad to be there, easily, without effort, circling back and opening forward, covering ground that matters and ground that doesn't, in the natural proportion of people who are comfortable enough to say both kinds of things. Derek sat across from me. He was different at this table than I'd seen him in years, more present, less performed, more like the man underneath the chairman than the chairman himself. Sandra caught my eye at one point, with the look of a woman who has watched her husband find his way back to something she'd been afraid he'd lost permanently, and is grateful in a way that goes beyond words. I nodded at her. She nodded back. After lunch, Thomas and Sandra went to the garden. Thomas had questions about what I was growing, and Sandra wanted to be in the sun. And Lily cleared the dishes with the decisive efficiency of someone who has made a unilateral decision about this task and is not accepting discussion. Which left Derek and me at the dining room table, with our coffee cups and the afternoon light coming through the windows, at that particular June angle that makes everything it touches look both ordinary and significant at the same time. He ran his hand along the edge of the oak table. He said he remembered this table. I told him he'd done his homework at it for 12 years. He said his mother used to bring him in here to do homework when she was cooking and wanted company in the house without actually having anyone underfoot. I told him that sounded exactly like her. He smiled. The real smile, without the professional finish that had overlaid it for a while. Just my son, at his mother's table, smiling at a memory of the woman who had made this house what it was. Then he looked at me and said he wanted me to know something. I told him I was listening. He said he knew he couldn't undo what had happened at the wedding. He knew that. But he wanted me to know that he thought about it. Not just what he'd done, but everything behind it. The years of work I'd done that he hadn't seen, hadn't acknowledged, hadn't known to be grateful for. The way his certainty about himself had made him blind to things that were right in front of him. He stopped a couple of times, started again, the way you do when you're saying something you've rehearsed in your head, and the real version keeps coming out differently than the rehearsed one. He said he was going to spend a long time making up for it. With me, with the company, with Lily. He said he just wanted me to know that he knew. I looked at him across that table. At the full and complicated man in front of me, his intelligence and his ambition and his genuine capacity for remorse and his stubbornness and his love and his courage in showing up at my door on a February night and saying the words out loud. All of it together. All of it mine, in the way that a father carries a son in him for as long as either of them draws breath. I told him I knew he knew. I told him that was enough. I told him the rest would take care of itself, the way things do when the foundation is solid. And the foundation was solid. It always had been. It had just needed both of us standing on it at the same time, which we were doing now. Which was all it had ever needed. He looked out the window at the garden, where Thomas and Sandra were walking in the June light. Then he looked back at me, and for just a moment, brief and unguarded, the way real things are always brief and unguarded, he looked like the 8-year-old boy who had called his grandmother from a job site to say he'd helped pour a foundation, needing someone he loved to know he'd done something real. I saw that boy clearly. I had always seen that boy. The afternoon moved slowly into evening, the way June afternoons do, when the light refuses to hurry and the world stays warm past the point where you expect it to. We went out to the garden, eventually, all of us, carrying our cups, moving between the beds and talking about things that mattered and things that didn't, in the right proportion, which is roughly equal. I looked around at them, Lily with her arm through Thomas's, Sandra laughing at something Derek had said, Derek standing in the garden of the house he'd grown up in, with the June light across his face. And I thought about Margaret. I thought about how much she would have loved this particular afternoon, how she would have been the center of it, asking the right questions, remembering what mattered to each person, making sure everyone had what they needed and a little more. I thought about how her absence is still a shape in things, even now. Not grief exactly, not anymore, but a kind of outline, the definition of a space that tells you what used to fill it. You don't stop missing people who mattered. You learn to let the missing exist alongside everything else, which is a different thing from letting it take up all the room. There was room. I had found that out. There was room for the missing and for the June afternoon and for all of it together. And the room was not diminished by holding everything at once. Before Lily and Thomas left, I walked them to the car the way I always do. At the car, she turned to me and said, "Same time next month." I told her I'd set the table. She kissed my cheek. Thomas shook my hand firmly, warmly. The handshake of a young man who has decided you are worth the full attention of the gesture. They got in the car, and I watched them drive away down Callaway Road in the June evening. The light still gold in the trees. One of Lily's arms out the open window. I stood there until they were gone around the curve. Then I went back inside. The dining room table was still set with the white linen and the flowers, and the afternoon's coffee cups pushed back at the angles that people leave them when they've been sitting and talking and gotten up to do something else. The chairs were pushed out from the table, each one at a slightly different angle. The specific geometry of a family meal that has gone on long enough for everyone to have shifted and resettled and shifted again. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a while. Then I went to the hallway and opened the drawer, the one where I keep the things that last, next to Margaret's photograph and my father's letter, and the small wooden cross from my parents' kitchen wall. And I took out the cream-colored card with my name on it. Lily's handwriting, Raymond Callaway. The card from the front row of the wedding. The one I'd folded into my jacket pocket and brought home, and kept, because some things you keep not because you need the reminder, but because the object itself has become part of the story, and the story deserves to be held somewhere. I carried it to the dining room. I set it at the head of the table, leaning against the vase of flowers, in the place where I had sat that afternoon with my family around me, where I had always sat at this table, where I would sit the next time, and the time after that, and however many times after that we were given, because that is what this life is made of, when you get down to it. Not the contracts or the titles or the front rows. The times after that. The next lunch. The next Saturday. The door unlocked and the coffee on, and the table set, and the people you love finding their way back to you, which they do, if you give them enough time. And you're still here when they arrive. Raymond Callaway, front row, not because of what I built, Not because of what I was owed, because of what I chose to do with the time I had, which was to love the people at my table without conditions, to forgive the ones who needed forgiving, to stay in the house with the door unlocked, and to set the table again every time it needed setting. That's the whole of it. That's everything. If you've listened this long, then you know what this story cost and what it returned. And I'm grateful you stayed with it. Stories like this one don't belong to the person who lived them. They belong to whoever needs to hear them. If this one was for you, then I'm glad it found you. Share it with someone who might be sitting in a third row somewhere, wondering if anyone noticed. Tell them someone did. Tell them the door is still unlocked. And if God has blessed you with people at your table, don't wait to tell them what they mean to you. Don't let the silence accumulate until it has a weight you can't lift alone. Say the thing. Make the call. Knock on the door. You've been listening, and that matters more than you know. God bless you and yours. The door's always unlocked.